Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 113, where we'll be continuing our exploration of the true spiders of the order Araneae. In the previous episode, we explored several 100 million years of spider evolution. We examined the general anatomy and physiology of the spider, and we took a closer look at the more basal lineages, like the primitive Mesotheli and the funnel web spiders and tarantulas of the Araneomorphae. In today's episode, we'll look at the more modern Araneomorphae clade, which contains more than 90% of all known extant spider species. Now, this episode will be exploring the biodiversity, the life strategies, the ecology, and the predator-prey dynamics of these spiders. I'll be building off of a lot of the concepts and evolutionary history that we talked about in Part 1, or episode 112, so if you haven't listened to that yet, then I strongly recommend you pause this episode, go back and listen to Part 1, and then come back and resume this episode, because all the stuff we're going to cover today is going to make a lot more sense if you're familiar with the basics of spider anatomy and evolution. I'll go over this material again briefly right now, just some of the highlights, to set the stage for the evolutionary emergence of the Araneomorphae. In Part 1, we covered the formation of the arthropods around 550 to 600 million years ago, the emergence of the chelicerates around 500 to 510 million years ago, the Planeturga around 468 million years ago, and from them, the true arachnids, which emerged around 435 million years ago. Throughout the rest of the Devonian and into the Carboniferous periods, the arachnids would produce a staggering diversity of creatures, from harvestmen to camel spiders to mites and ticks to scorpions. One lineage, emerging in the middle of the Devonian around 380 to 390 million years ago, had a very unique adaptation. This lineage could produce a strange, stretchy, sticky substance called silk. And silk could be used for all kinds of purposes. It could be used to build nests or to build traps. It could be used to build trigger lines that help the arachnid stay aware of its surroundings. Silk could be used to wrap up food for later consumption, or to protect and cushion a clutch of eggs. Being able to produce silk provided enormous evolutionary benefits. And as the Devonian wrapped up and the world saw the golden age of the Carboniferous forests, these terrestrial silk-producing arachnids would undergo dramatic diversification in their own right. Not only were there new and divergent lineages, such as the Europyge whip scorpions that showed up around 360 million years ago, and the Amblypyge whip spiders that diverged from them around 315 million years ago, but also new types of silks were evolved, and new structures, new shapes, new ways of spinning the silk were adapted. The true spiders, the Araneae, emerged about 310 to 330 million years ago from within this clade of silk-spinning arachnids. In episode 112, we looked at the most primitive living lineage of Araneae, known as the Mesotheli. These spiders do not build webs, but instead they use their silk to weave flat sheets. These silk sheets can be used as trapdoors, or they can be rolled up and used to line the inside of a tunnel or a burrow. The Megalomorphs, the second oldest branch of Araneae spiders, also builds web-lined burrows and trapdoors, but there's a few species that have figured out how to make the more classical web. Another old lineage that I didn't mention in the last episode are the Paratropididae. These so-called bald-legged spiders, found in northern Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama, are an evolutionary intermediary between the older Megalomorphs and the more derived Araneomorphs. All of this arachnid biodiversity would thrive in the world's terrestrial environments throughout the Carboniferous and into the Permian. Many species were wiped out by the end Carboniferous rainforest collapse, and the subsequent reduction of forest biomes, ecological complexity, and atmospheric oxygen. But overall, most lineages survived in some capacity to witness the drier, warmer days of the Permian. Here, these ancient arachnids would have witnessed the amniotes diverge into the synapsids and the sauropsids, the two vertebrate clades that would go on to produce the mammals and the reptiles, respectively. Now, things were pretty good for a while. The dry, warm climate of the Permian created ideal conditions to drive the evolution of terrestrial ecosystems. The arachnids, especially the spiders, were heavily involved in this process. They were top-down regulators of populations of smaller arthropods, keeping their numbers in check and protecting local vegetation from overconsumption by these little insect herbivores. The arachnids were also food for all manner of terrestrial animals, including the many new species of small synapsid proto-rodents and tiny sauropsid proto-lizards. These arachnids were an important part of the food chain and the ecology of the late Paleozoic, but that would soon come to an end. There have been several great mass extinction events in the Earth's history, events where some horrible double-digit percentage of Earth's species are wiped out, and it takes the biosphere millions of years to recover the lost ecological complexity and species diversity. Of these, there have been hundreds of small events, and 5 primary big events, big extinction events, 6 of them if you include the current human-caused or anthropogenic mass extinction. Of those original 5 mass extinction events, the biggest and most destructive of them, the most deadly mass extinction event of them all, came at the end of the Permian. It's not known exactly what caused these mass extinctions, but it's suspected that massive, long-term, ongoing volcanic eruptions in the Siberian traps put so much CO2 into the atmosphere that it warmed the Earth, leading to the oceans becoming more acidic and anoxic. The end result was the extinction of 81% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species. The arthropods, despite their small size and generally sturdy, robust nature, were not spared. The trilobites were completely wiped out. The eurypterids, flagging though they were now completely wiped out. The ostracod seed shrimp, members of the plankton and critically important for the marine food chain, had nearly 60% of their genera wiped out. During the Carboniferous, there were also many insect genera that had evolved. They thrived for much of the Permian, but the end Permian mass extinction destroyed around 30% of them, mostly the older lineages that weren't as well adapted to the increasingly hot, dry conditions. Despite all of this death, or perhaps as a result of it, the world's ecologies were emptied, and habitats had to be regenerated. It took 30 million years for the world to recover, and in all that time, many of the survivors had adapted and diversified to fill in the empty ecological niches, to provide ecological services, and to rebuild their shattered habitats. This was the state of things. This was the world into which the earliest Araneomorphae emerged, around 250 million years ago at the start of the Triassic. 2 defining traits of the Araneomorphae clade can be seen in the ancestral species that lived in the time immediately following the end Permian mass extinction. The first adaptation involved the Chelicera and the fangs. Where the older Mesotheli and Megalomorphae spiders had chelicera that pointed straight down and were useful for providing basic vertical strikes on prey animals, the new Araneomorphae had chelicera that were angled inwards, pointing diagonally towards each other across the face. This new arrangement of the chelicera was a bit more flexible. The spiders could attack prey animals with a range of different motions now, like using a scissor-like cutting motion, for example, and not just the vertical top-down strikes used by the likes of tarantulas and funnel-web spiders. The second adaptation involved the book lungs. One pair of these relatively inefficient respiratory organs was adapted into a more efficient tracheal network. This respiratory adaptation allowed the Araneomorphae to more efficiently absorb and utilize oxygen, which in turn provided more energy to the tissues, and enabled greater activity levels and more active hunting. Paired with the adapted Chelicera, these newly emerged Araneomorphs were especially deadly predators, ready to take on the many challenges of the Triassic. The first major clade of Araneomorph spiders to emerge were the Synspermiata, so named for the chemical behavior of their sperm. Specifically, pairs or groups of spermatids can huddle together or fuse and form a capsule-like structure around their heads. Presumably, this improves their motility or offers some kind of chemical protection during the trip through the female reproductive organs, although the capsule needs to be removed and the sperm disconnected and individuated before they can fertilize an egg cell. The basal Synspermiata are all haplogynes, which means the females have a single genital opening. This is part of their overall simpler, more primitive genital physiology. Well, primitive compared to the rest of the Araneomorphs. The male inserts sperm via his palpal bulbs, which is then stored inside the female's body in 2 spermatheca chambers, to be held in reserve until eggs are released from the ovaries. In contrast, a more complex, more derived genital physiology can be seen in groups like the intelligyne spiders, which have 2 additional genital openings, each of them leading directly to one of the spermatheca storage chambers. The main benefit to this evolved morphology is an improvement in sperm flow through the female's genitals, which may offer improvements to genital cleanliness and fertility, and even a limited capacity to prioritize the passage of sperm from preferential males. The Synspermiata are a relatively primitive Araneomorph clade, and they haven't evolved this trait, so they're all haplogynes. There's another trait that unites all the Synspermiata. They are ecribellate spiders, meaning they lack a cribellum. Briefly, a cribellum is like a specialized spinneret that has a large number of very small spigots, which exude silk. The cribellum is essentially an organ for deploying silk, but only a specialized type of silk, which comes out in bundles of extremely thin, nanometer-scale fibers. When the spider combs out this silk to use it for some purpose, like building a web or wrapping up its eggs, the silk will get all curled up and woolly. This cribellate silk is typically used to pad the web lining of a burrow, or to protect and insulate the eggs. It's not the kind of silk used to build webs, although cribellate silk can be added to a web, where it serves as a floofy wreath of sticky death. Cribellate silk forms strong bonds with the carbon chains in wax compounds, like those found in an insect's cuticle. So even though it's not the primary silk used to make a web, it's still more than capable of binding to and tangling up and catching prey insects. Evolutionarily, the cribellum appears to be a feature that's ancestral to the Araneomorphae, although over time, many lineages have apparently evolved to lose it. Curiously, the lineages that don't have a cribellum tend to be more species-rich than those that still possess one. The Synspermiata are one such Araneomorphae family, whose common ancestor has lost the cribellum. As the correlation suggests, the Synspermiata should be a relatively large and diverse group. And it is! There are 17 different spider families within the Synspermiata. Many of them have a suite of weird features, unusual among spiders, and unusual even among other arachnids. For example, many of these Synspermiata families are full of spiders that have fewer than 8 eyes. Many of them have 6 eyes, like the spiders in the Orsilobidae family, the freakish Pholcidae carpenter spiders, and the Cytodidae spitting spiders, among many others. On that note, these Cytodidae spiders are super cool because they hunt by spewing out a sticky venomous wad of silk onto their prey, kind of like what velvet worms do, but coming from a predator that's much faster and much more dangerous. The Sicariidae family is also interesting because of its dangerous member species, like the notorious brown recluse Loxosceles reclusa. Their danger comes in their venom, which contains compounds like sphingomyelinase D, a chemical found in no other arachnids, and which can catalyze the hydrolysis of, and thus destabilize, the myelin sheathing on neural cell membranes. At the macro level, this can be potentially necrotic, leading to horrible, rotting, sunken flesh wounds, characteristic of loxocelism. The six-eyed woodlouse hunters of the Dysderidae family are predators equipped with large, powerful chelicera, which they use to puncture the carapace of beetles and to utterly destroy lice. Unlike most other Synspermiata, the Dysderidae can be found mostly in the northern hemisphere, as opposed to families like the Ocheiroceratidae, which live in caves and leaf litter in tropical jungles mostly across the equatorial belt. The Segastriidae tube-dwelling spiders, also with 6 eyes, are known to build sprawling silk-lined tunnels under rocks and tree bark, similar to the more primitive funnel web spiders, but with more complex burrows. The Telemidae, known as long-legged cave spiders, also have species with 6 eyes, but due to their cave-dwelling lifestyle and associated adaptations like translucent limbs, many species have evolved to go blind, or actually lose all of their eyes. Some groups, like the armored spiders of the Tetrablemidae family, include species with just 4 eyes, as well as those with no eyes at all. The Paculidae family, similar to the armored spiders but larger and beefier, also have 6 eyes. The Caponeidae family is composed of relatively small orange, red, and earthy-colored species that are a little strange for several reasons. They don't have any book lungs, they just breathe through the trachea. Their spinnerets have a totally different spatial presentation on the abdomen. And apparently, a majority of Caponeidae species only have 2 eyes. And then you have the Uinopode goblin spiders, which include species that have 8, 6, 4, 2, and sometimes, in the species that live in caves, 0 eyes. This goblin spider family is noteworthy in that it's relatively species-rich. Most of these families that I've listed so far have dozens to hundreds of species, which is actually pretty small by arthropod standards. But this Uinopode family has about 1,800 known and described species, with an estimated 2,000 to 2,500 total species. These are very, very small spiders, with a very large distribution, covering most areas of the world. Another large family is the Pholcidae, which includes more than 1,800 species of cellar spider, skull spider, vibrating spider, and daddy longlegs, although this last name is more commonly applied to the much older Apillionese lineage of harvestman spiders. They're not true spiders. The Pholcids, which are true spiders, have a global distribution, except in the Arctic and Antarctic, and they don't have sticky webs. Instead, they build really complex, irregular webs that trap prey insects like they're in a maze or a labyrinth. Pholcids are also known to hunt and eat other spiders, including by raiding their webs to pillage eggs and pre-captured prey. While these are some of the larger Synspermiata families, there's also some really, really small families too. One yellow-orange-colored species, the Trogloraptor marchingtoni, is the only species in its genus, and the only genus in its family, Trogloraptoridae. The Trogloraptor marchingtoni doesn't grow very large, no bigger than a 3-inch leg span, but they do have engorged pedipalps and the wicked hawk-like hooked claws on the ends of their legs, for which they're named. Another family, Perigopidae, has only 1 genera containing a mere 3 species, all of which can be found in eastern Australia and New Zealand. The plectrurid spiders of the family Plectruridae actually have 8 eyes like most other spiders, but this is a very small and relatively undiverse clade found today only near Mexico and some islands in the Caribbean. The Plectruridæ are largely mysterious and unfamiliar creatures, unstudied in any detail aside from the basics of their behavior and web construction. The plectrids are also members of the so-called lost trachea clade. The tracheal respiratory structures were originally adapted long ago from the rear pair of book lungs, and these spiders have evolved to get rid of the structures entirely. Alright, so that wraps up the 17 ecribulate haplogyne families of the Synspermiata clade. It's quite a technical mouthful for you there. Now, most modern molecular analyses have identified a small offshoot from the primitive Synspermiata. This offshoot formed two smaller families, the Philostatidae crevice weaver spiders and the Hypnochilidae lampshade spiders. Now, the Philostatidae crevice weavers are haplogynes, just like the rest of their Synspermiata cousins. But unlike them, the Philostatidae still retain the cribellum, and they use it to produce woolly silk. They'll find hidden spaces, like burrows in the soil or crevices in rock, that they'll line with webbing. So in that sense, they're much like the funnel weaver spiders that we talked about in the last episode. The Philostatidae often hunt by popping out of their hollow to surprise prey and drag them back in. Sometimes the prey fights back, and the crevice weaver has to brace itself against the walls of its hollow to avoid being pulled out into the open where the spider is in danger. This dynamic has led to an altered femur physiology in the crevice weaver's front pair of legs that allows them more freedom of movement within their nest, and it also gives them a limited ability to use their knees to hang onto the burrow with their feet dangling further out to grab the prey animal. So it's a form of base security that keeps them anchored in their burrow so that a struggling prey animal doesn't pull them out, so that they're suddenly exposed and in the sunlight where a bird or something could opportunistically fly by and grab them. Now, the other family I mentioned, the other part of this small offshoot, the Hypochilidae family, is also primitive in form and behavior, much like the Philostatidae and many of their shared Synspermiata cousins. The Hypochilidae, or the lampshade spiders, have freakishly long limbs, and they have two pairs of book lungs, instead of one pair plus a tracheal system. And many member species have their chelicera, their fangs, oriented in some intermediate position between the vertical orientation of the Megalomorpha and the diagonal orientation of most other Araneomorphae. The lampshade spiders are named after the shape of their web. All 12 species of Hypochilidae live in rugged, mountainous areas, with caves and big rock formations. They build their webs on the ceilings of the caves and the undersides of rock outcroppings. These webs usually begin as circles along the rock face, which are then built up into cylinders of web that hang down from the rock. The open end of the cylinder is pulled outward with silky support filaments, creating the flared opening at the bottom that resembles the titular lampshade shape. Okay, so these three groups, the Synspermiata superfamily and the divergent Philostatidae and Hypochilidae families, are all products of a basal lineage that diverged early in Araneomorph history. These three groups together belong to a lineage that's sister to the rest of the Araneomorphae, to a lineage which continued to evolve and radiate for millions of years after the ancestral Synspermiata diverged and went on their own evolutionary path. Many of these new families, alas, were still somewhat primitive, continuing to express various traits seen in much older spider lineages. The Leptonetidae, for example, which emerged sometime near the end of the Jurassic, as well as their closely related Archoleptonetidae cousins, have retained the more primitive haplogyne anatomy of their female genitals, and they possess just 6 eyes, like so many of the Synspermiata. Another branch produced the Ostrocheiloids, which include the Andean forest spiders of the Ostrochilidae family, and the frightening large-clawed spiders of the Gradungulidae family. All 16 species of these Gradungulidae spiders are endemic to eastern Australia and New Zealand, and most of them are quite beefy, with savage and powerful chelicera. Aside from their particularly badass physiology, the Gradungulidae are known to build elaborate nests with all sorts of features, including escape hatches and hideout areas, ground platforms, ladders, scaffolding, and more. For example, 3 of these species produce a cribellum. One of them, the odd-clawed spider Prograndungula otwaensis, uses its woolly cribellum silk to make a snare or a trap in the shape of a ladder. This ladder shape is used more like a net. The spider hangs upside down during the night from a branch of a myrtle beech tree, their limbs staying still, close to the corners of the ladder, or this net-like webbing which has been laid flat on the ground or in a hole in a tree. When a prey animal, like some tiny hapless insect, walks across this woolly net laid out flat on the ground, the spider will attack and quickly wrap up the prey animal in the sheet of webbing where it can be easily injected with venom before the webbing falls apart, or before the insect can struggle and squirm and crawl its way out. Before it can escape, the spider will inject it with venom and paralyze it so that it's basically doomed. It'll be wrapped in a different kind of silk and put to the side, where it'll be saved for some future dinner. The final branches of the Araneomorphae lineage would produce the Palpamanoidea and the Intelliginae superfamilies, sometime in the late Triassic. Now, the Palpamanoids are also known as the assassin spiders because of their common evolutionary niche as a predator of smaller spiders. For these assassin spiders, their hunting strategy is one of active invasion. They seek out the webs and burrows and hiding places of other spiders. They enter the burrow or the lair or the web. They root out the spider that lives there, and they kill and eat them. The Palpamanoids are distributed unequally across 5 families. The most basal family, with a absolutely crazy, very hard to pronounce name, is the Mechasmachinidae, with 25 species found in New Zealand and the tip of South America. A later lineage, a later offshoot, would produce the 155 species of the Palpamanidae, many of which have front legs evolved into gargantuan, thickly muscled, and heavily armored limbs, which they use to beat up, ensnare, drag around, and break apart the bodies of their spider prey. When on the hunt, their chelicera are held straight outwards, like the spider equivalent of stalking around with mouth open and fangs bared, salivating with excitement to bite the first thing they can find. Closely related to these brutish Palpamanidae spiders are the Hatoneidae family, with 20 or so species, most of which are still technically undescribed. The remaining 2 Palpamanoid families are closely related to each other. There's the Stenochilidae, which emerged sometime in the late Cretaceous and today is represented by 12 species of spider found across South and Southeast Asia. These Stenochilidae spiders diverged from the even older Archaeidae spiders, which themselves originated in the mid-Jurassic and today have some 90 species in South Africa and Australia. The Archaeidae are unique in that they have a really weird, elongated section in the head called a neck. Imagine if your head suddenly grew 8 or 9 inches taller, but just between your lips and your eyes, and your nose had to grow longer to fill in the space. That's what these Archaeidae spiders have. They have a weird, cylindrical neck section in their head, which led to the evolution of awkwardly long chelicera that could reach down to the mouth. All in all, it makes for a really neat, really unique, but also kind of goofy shape to the spider's head. Okay, so let's regroup for a moment. We first looked at the basal Synspermiata superfamily, and then the closely related Philostatidae and Hypochilidae families. Then we looked at more intermediate groups, like the Leptonetidae, the Archoleptonetidae, the Ostrochilidae, and the Gradungulidae. And then we covered the members of the Palpamanoidea superfamily. Alright, that's a lot of taxonomy, a lot of phylogenies and evolutionary relationships, but now there's just one more group of Araneomorphae spiders. There's one more superfamily. These are the Intelliginae, which emerged around 200 to 210 million years ago at the beginning of the Jurassic period. You might recall from earlier in the episode when I was discussing the genital anatomy of haplogyne and entelogyne spiders. The primitive haplogyne anatomy, where the female has a single genital opening, is common across much of the more basal Araneomorphae. The more derived genital form, with 3 openings, is the titular feature of the entelogyne superfamily. However, biology is quite messy, and things aren't always so clear-cut. In this case, there's several genera and species within the entelogyne superfamily which have actually evolved to lose the 2 lateral openings and revert to the more primitive haplogyne form. Within this entelogyne superfamily, depending on the study that you're looking at, there's usually more than 60, almost 70 families. Now, I won't go over all of them, as it would be exhaustive and repetitive, so instead, I'm going to take a look at some of the biggest families, the most ecologically important families, and the families that exhibit some particularly interesting physical feature or behavior. For example, there are several families of so-called sac spiders. The name comes from their tendency to build small silk bags, or sacs, hanging from the leaves and the stems of plants. The spiders use these silk-spun sacs as temporary shelter, protecting them from the elements and providing a place to hide from predators. Consider the Anaphenidae family. Anaphenid sac spiders will build their sacs on plants, like in the crevices and cracks of bark on a tree. They'll use this as a base of operations for patrolling the tree, seeking out prey insects like harmful herbivores and their eggs. In this way, the anaphenids have a sort of symbiotic relationship with the tree, or whatever kind of plant that they live on. Another neat habitat and lifestyle can be seen in the Decidae family, which includes over 300 species of spider that usually lives near the coastline. They like to live near the ocean. That's because these spiders prey on small crustaceans, like tiny crabs that are regularly exposed to dry air during low tide. The Decidae spiders will creep into the intertidal zone to look around, pick through the rocks and comb through the sand to catch a tiny crustacean for lunch before returning to their nests before the tide comes back in. Alright, now let's take a look at the largest family of entelogyne spiders. This would be the Salticidae family, with over 6,000 described species of jumping spiders. This single family represents some 13% of all spiders, and among its many member species, you'll find a wide range of very impressive abilities and fascinating physical features. The namesake ability of the jumping spiders is a fast, powerful leap, or a jump, made with the 2 hind pairs of legs that the Salticidae use when hunting. These are active daytime hunters with complex hunting strategies. When they approach prey, they often don't take a direct route, but instead they'll take an indirect, circuitous route. At times, they may even lose sight of the prey, but they're able to remember its location and stay focused on their longer-term goal. They can use their impressive jumping abilities to quickly cross rough terrain, to bridge gaps or gain the high ground, from which they can dangle down on a bit of silk to ambush prey. When they're not actively roaming around hunting for food, they sit and they hide, and they watch, and they wait, often in little silk tents or sleeping bags that they make several times a day. While they mostly eat insects and other arachnids, some species are also known to drink nectar. Remember that spiders are fluid feeders, and they can get sugary nutrients from plant nectar. Some of these Salticidae jumping spiders have figured this out, and so they include regular visits to flowers as part of their diet to get some nectar. Their excellent jumping and hunting skills suggest 2 remarkable things. The Salticidae jumping spiders are really intelligent, and they have extremely good vision. Their 2 main eyes are huge and mounted on the front of the head. just like those of a mammalian predator. They have lenses and 4 layered retinas, with 4 types of receptor cells in the cornea that produce tetrachromatic color vision, with a particular sensitivity to lower energy ultraviolet wavelengths. While their field of vision is relatively small, what they can see, they see in high definition and with bright colors. It also helps that the main pair of eyes can move around a bit, so the spider can look around its environment without having to move its whole body. This is particularly useful if you're trying to sit and watch the environment to scan for prey animals without moving your own body to give away your position, because a predator could see out of its peripheral vision the movement of the jumping spider's legs, or a prey animal could suddenly see it moving against the background, realize that it's there, and then run away. The ability for the jumping spider to just sit perfectly still and look around with eyes that can move a little bit in their sockets is actually a really profound and beneficial ability. Then you have pairs of secondary lateral eyes that are generally smaller and simpler, but have been specialized to be sensitive to green or blue light, to levels of light or darkness, or to motion in the periphery. This extreme visual capacity and complex hunting strategies suggest very high intelligence for these jumping spiders. And experiments have demonstrated their learning abilities, their memory, and their ability to adapt and try new strategies. It's been confirmed that they do indeed have a startling level of intelligence, with an uncanny ability to map out their environment and devise a sneaky path of approach to their prey. In a single hunt, a jumping spider can exhibit abilities only seen in some vertebrates, like object permanence, theory of mind, the ability to wait for a reward, the ability to assess and adapt strategies when necessary, and much more. I should clarify that these abilities are seen in other arthropods and invertebrates, like, for example, many of the Mesotheli and Megalomorphae have the ability to wait for a reward. That's how they hunt. They wait for prey to come by and then they ambush the prey. But in the jumping spiders, in these Salticity, we see all of these things. Object permanence, theory of mind, so on and so forth. It's really, really impressive stuff. Alright, now moving on, the second largest intelligine family is the Lionopheidae, with more than 4,700 species of sheet weavers and money spiders. The name money spider comes from a superstition that if one of these crawls on you, it's a sign of good financial fortune in your future. Now, I'm not quite sure about that, but in terms of their biology, these are very small spiders, small enough that many of them can travel via ballooning, a method wherein they release a strand of silk into the air, the silk catches the wind, and, like a parasail, sweeps them up into the air where they can ride on air currents. This particular method of locomotion is believed to be responsible for their global distribution. Although small in size, the Lionopheidae are numerous and abundant. Their sheer biomass is a robust source of protein for predators like birds, and their own predation serves as a powerful down-regulator of voracious herbivores like aphids and springtails. The third largest family are the Araneae, which includes over 3,000 species of orb weaver spiders. Now, these are the most common orb-weaving spiders that you're going to find out in the wild. Some species produce a unique crisscrossing bed section in the middle of the web, called a stabilimentum. They hang out on this central hammock area, this stabilimentum, waiting for prey to land on the sticky parts of the web. Many of them are known to eat their webs every day, only to make a new web the next day, but some species don't build any webs at all. Instead, these species use their silk to make clumps or wads, sort of like a rubber band ball, and then they dangle that from their legs while hanging off of a branch or something. This sticky ball of webbing is loaded with pheromones that can attract male moths, who come close and then get stuck on the ball of silk, making them easy prey for the orb weaver. In the Cretaceous fossil record, there's evidence of a radiation, a blossoming of species diversity among the flowering plants. As insects evolved a symbiotic relationship with flowering plants, the insect pollinators also experienced irradiation around the same time. It turns out that the orb weavers are very effective insect predators, particularly of flying insects, and irradiation of orb weavers is also seen in correlation with the insect radiation that is itself seen in correlation with the radiation of flowering plants. There's a pretty compelling argument to be made as to whether flowering plants or orb weaver spiders actually had a bigger part to play in driving the radiation and diversification of these Cretaceous insects. Other large Intelligine families include the Theridiidae cobweb spiders, which include some 3,000 species, most of which are highly inbred and highly social, and others which are sneaky spider parasites, living in and stealing food from the webs of other spiders, even occasionally attacking and eating the host spider itself. This reminds me of the Mimetidae, the pirate spiders. These creatures prey on other spiders, and they've evolved pretty insidious strategies to do it. For example, Mimetidae spiders have been seen plucking the silk strands of another spider's web to simulate the struggling movements of a stuck prey insect. The host spider, curious at the disturbance and the vibrations in its web, will reveal itself. It'll come out of its hiding spot and approach what it thinks is a fresh meal. Except instead of some new-caught insect ready to be wrapped up in silk and eaten sometime later, it's the Mimetidae spider, and it'll launch an attack on the unaware host, wrap them up in its own silk, envenomate them, and eat them. Back on the topic of large spider families, there's the Lycosidae wolf spiders, with more than 2,800 species of large, powerful, fast-moving, camouflaged hunters, whose most notable trait is the female's ability to carry the young around in a silk egg sac attached to her spinnerets, which allows her to move around and even hunt while bringing the kids along for a ride. Then there's the Nephosidae ground spiders, with over 2,500 species that forego building webs in favor of just chasing down and tackling their prey before wrapping them up in a thick type of sticky silk. The Thomisidae, with over 2,100 species of crab spider, many of which hang out on flowers or fruits waiting for insects. The Agilenidae funnel weavers, with over 1,300 species of small, super-fast ambush hunters that lay down the spider version of Velcro sheets to catch their prey. And the Sparacidae, with over 1,300 species of giant crab spiders and wood spiders, which live in warmer, temperate, and tropical forests, where they use their potent venom to hunt the typical arthropod prey, but also small vertebrates like birds and lizards. Speaking of venomous spiders, I already mentioned the Sicariidae family, which includes the notoriously dangerous brown recluse spider Loxosceles reclusa, as well as the Lycosidae family with its many venomous wolf spiders. But there's also the Ctenidae family, which includes over 500 species of wandering spider. These are mostly nocturnal hunters that do not build webs or nests, but instead they spend the day hiding in crevices, and they spend evenings and nights prowling around on the jungle floor looking for prey. They're also known to be very easily agitated and very defensive, and they'll lash out and attack at the smallest provocation. Some of the largest and most aggressive Ctenidae spiders are found in the Phonutria genus, and among them, the Phonutria nigraventer is the largest and most aggressive. These large spiders live in warm areas, from temperate to tropical forests, where they don't build nests or webs, but instead they prowl around on the jungle floor actively hunting prey, from insects to small vertebrates like rodents or lizards. These larger, more venomous spiders are able to take down a wide variety of prey. Small insects, large insects, millipedes, centipedes, other spiders, and yes, even small vertebrates. But other spiders, such as those with less physical strength or less potent venoms, may be restricted to a narrower variety of smaller prey. For example, the Emauxenidae family includes 18 species of so-called termite hunters. They feed exclusively on termites. Ant colonies are also popular targets for spiders. Various species within the Gallieniellidae family, the Isobiidae family, and the Zodariidae family feed predominantly or exclusively on ants. The Zodariidae family takes this to an extreme degree. These spiders will infiltrate ant colonies and live their entire lives pretending to be an ant, mimicking their behavior and even producing similar pheromone chemicals. And while this might fool the ants into thinking that these Zodariidae spiders are just another ant in the colony, in reality, they're actually kind of like a Cylon or one of the aliens from They Live. In other words, from the ants' perspective, the Zodariidae spiders are kind of like hidden killers that live among them. Now, the last big topic that I want to touch on today is spider sociality. Most spiders are solitary. They live on their own, they hunt on their own, and the only time they interact with another spider is when they're defending their territory from other spiders or when they're seeking out a mate. This is the case for the vast majority of spiders. They tend to be solitary creatures by nature, but some species exhibit an unusual degree of sociality. They may live in communal nests. They may contribute their captured prey to a communal pool of food and help raise the offspring of other spiders. For example, the Oxyopidae family contains a handful of social species. Some are considered social only because they tend to tolerate the presence of other members, while other species, such as one species in the Tapinolus genus, have full-blown colonies with dozens to hundreds of spiders. The Araneae family of velvet spiders also includes a number of social species that live in colonies. And some species, such as Stegodiphyus saracenorum, are known to build communal webs. They cooperate to hunt prey together, and they help rear the broods of their fellow spiders. This level of childcare is unusual in spiders, but the S. saracenorum take it to an extreme. Sometimes a mother spider will deliberately liquefy her own organs, vomit up the melted gore, and then feed it to her offspring. When all of her organs have been destroyed in this way, she'll die, and her offspring will consume her hollow corpse for nutrients. It really is wild, the range in parenting behaviors that you see among the spiders. Most spiders don't parent their young at all, while other spiders do show some level of brood care, and a small minority of them, like the S. saracenorum, do crazy stuff like kill themselves to feed their offspring. Okay, everybody, I think that this is a pretty good place to stop. We've explored the Araneomorph spiders in great detail, from the primitive Synspermiata to the more derived and wildly diverse Intelligine spiders. Combine both this episode and the previous episode, and we have a thorough exploration of the evolution of spiders, as well as their anatomy and physiology, their life history, their family diversity, and their ecological roles. To summarize everything that we've learned over these last 2 episodes, the spiders are an ancient arthropod lineage that have had extremely influential roles in terrestrial environments. The spiders exist in virtually every terrestrial habitat all over the world, with the exception of Antarctica. Wherever they live, the spiders are very effective hunters of insects and even crustaceans, and depending on the size of the species in question, they can even hunt small vertebrates. The spiders are a powerful down-regulator on populations of insects. Their webs intercept flying insects. Their traps catch bugs creeping on the ground, and those that live on trees and other plants offer a symbiotic benefit by preying on the herbivorous insects that eat their leaves, like aphids and thrips. The spiders are also food for a wide variety of predators, from frogs to lizards to birds and arthropod-eating mammals. So the spiders have an extremely important place in the food chain and in the greater ecology. Alright, that is all that I have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit that like button. If you're listening to the show through a podcast app, then be sure to give the show a 5-star review. If you want to support the show in other ways, then check out the official store or become a Patreon supporter. And as always, thank you so much for listening.